the 1967 version of the Jungle Book. All right, let me explain the whole movie then. Thanks for your participation. Kind of the premise of the movie is there was a young little baby that was found in the jungle by a panther. By the way, this isn't real. Case found by a panther. The little boy needed to be cared for. So what better group of animals to raise a little boy than a pack of wolves? So that's kind of what it's like anyway, raising boys. Found it is. It is just the more the merrier and destructive. And so this pack of wolves was raising this boy, but there was a problem when the boy was getting older. The great tiger, Shere Khan, was coming back into the jungle, and the tiger had found out that this little boy, this man cub, was living in the jungle, and he had set his attention, his eyes on killing this boy. So Bagheera, the panther who had found Mowgli, the little boy, alongside the pack of wolves, decided that the boy, Mowgli, needed to go back to the village. And so Bagheera set off with Mowgli, and they had a number of encounters with various animals, most of them quite comical, and one of my favorites was with a herd of elephants. The herd of elephants was led by the great Colonel Hathi. Hathi was a soldier of old who had done great things on the battlefield, and he loved to pontificate and tell stories. And he was a pretty good storyteller, but there was one thing that he continued to lean in on, is he would say that as an elephant never forgets. The funny thing is that he was prone to forgetting. He was prone to forgetting where he was in his story, and even at one point, as the herd of elephants was marching behind him and he was scolding his little son, he forgot to tell the elephant herd to halt, and they run right into the Colonel Hathi, and Mowgli makes fun of him for being an elephant that actually did forget. It's one thing to say you never forget and to prove yourself wrong. It's something entirely different to say you never forget and actually never forget. God never forgets. Or as we could say it in the positive, God always remembers. Last week, or over the last number of weeks, we've had the opportunity to kind of lean into the life of Noah, all beginning with the kind of the drastic situation where the earth had gone completely sideways. Humankind was desperately depraved to the point to where they did evil continually. At the core of all people was this evil nature. And God set his mind to blot humankind from the face of the planet, but Noah found favor in the eyes of God. And so God set in motion this plan of salvation. He put it in Noah's heart and in his mind the mission of building an ark that would preserve humankind as well as God's creation. And that's what Noah did. It took him between 50 to 75 years to build an ark. And at the end of that, this is where we got into last week, is the rains came. Noah and his wife, his sons and their wives got onto the ark along with the animals. God shut the door to the ark and the earth was flooded. And we have the wide spectrum of emotions. We have the at one end just the being great, the gratefulness that God was able to save and preserve. But as we're very honest about that story is shrouded in devastation and destruction for all of humankind. Outside of those 8 people died. It was a great reset by God. God had put it in Noah's heart to build the ark. The ark was built. Noah was on the ark. The floods came. And I wonder at what point Noah looked around and went, so what do we do next? Noah didn't know, but God knew. And in Genesis chapter 8, verse 1, we see four beautiful words. But God remembered Noah. Well, we could do an entire series on the number of times we see those two words, the words, but God. They often come on the heels of something catastrophic, of great question and wondering what's to happen next, but God always knows. And in this situation, as Noah is on the ark, the floods have come, humanity has been destroyed except for those 8 followers of God. But God remembered Noah. And when we think through that, please hear this. When we get this idea of remembering, it's not that God was able to call to mind what he had said he was going to do. It's not that God had forgotten and then all of a sudden remembered. When we see these words, God remembered, it's God holding true to the covenant that he had made with Noah. God was going to carry through on his promise. This morning, as we look at this, the back end of the flood, and as the results from the earth being flooded, and then the now what, I want us to look at this, that God always remembers. God always remembers. I don't know where you find yourself this morning. I don't know if you are on a mountaintop experience or you're walking through a deep, dark valley. I want you to know that if you're a follower of God, he will always remember you. So this morning, as we look at this story, I want us to do so through the lens of God remembering Noah, but carrying that out to today where God also remembers us. Let me read the passage and then we'll do a little bit of unpacking. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth and the water subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained. And the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. And the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. And at the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent forth a raven. It went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out from the ark. And the dove came back to him in the evening, and behold, in her mouth was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent forth the dove, and she did not return to him anymore. In the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried from off the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. In the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. Then God said to Noah, "Go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you, all flesh, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by families from the ark. God always remembers. One of the things that we see here is that when God remembers, it demonstrates his faithfulness. When God remembers, it demonstrates his faithfulness. God was faithful to the covenant that he had established with Noah. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 18, we see God tell Noah, "But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you." God had established a covenant of salvation. And when God remembers, when God holds true to his covenant, it reminds us that he is a faithful God. God is always faithful to the promises that he establishes with his people. If he were not so, he would not be God. If God forgot his promises, he would cease to be God. But God never forgets the promises that he makes. And not only does he not forget the promises that he makes, he holds true to those promises, and they remind us that he is a faithful God. And that wasn't just something that Noah was able to experience. That's something that we are also able to experience. We can rest assured that God will remain faithful to his people today, just like he remained faithful to his people then. And the Bible is filled with promises that he makes with his people. A beautiful one is found in John 14, verse 3. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. God, in his remembrance, demonstrates his faithfulness, and that carries over to us. God remembers us. But when God remembers, doesn't just demonstrate his faithfulness, we also see that when God remembers, it is always timely. When God remembers, it is always timely. When we read through this story, we see that everything happened when it was supposed to happen. God's timing is always right, even if his timing isn't always preferred. Have you ever wished that God's timing was a little bit different? Have you ever preferred that God's timing looked a little bit more like your timing? If not, I think you're a liar. I think we've always at times established what we think would be the perfect timing of something. But know this, God's timing is always right. But even though God's timing is always right, it doesn't mean that his timing is always easy. God told Noah and his family to go into the ark. How many days did the rains come? 40 days. 40 days. It dumped buckets. You ever looked outside and it was raining for a little while and you thought, man, it sure would be nice if it quit raining? Imagine 40 days of looking outside to the point to where you look outside and you no longer see the ground around whatever you're in. Where our house is located, we found when it rains buckets, all the water comes toward us. And I look out and go, man, that's a lot of water. 40 days, and they couldn't see a thing. But it didn't take just 40 days for the water to go away. Now, Noah and his family, they were on that boat for a long time. For over a year, they were on that boat. And in that process, God's timing didn't make things easy, but God's timing was right. And God provided throughout that time. God set it in their minds how much they needed to bring on the ark in order to take care of their family and the animals. And it was perfect. And in that moment, in following God's timeliness, Noah and patience became fast friends. We see in verse number 6, at the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent forth a raven, but realized that the land had not dried up. He sends out a dove. The dove comes back without any place to set her feet. So it says in verse number 10 that he waited another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. At that time, the dove came back, and in her mouth a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent forth the dove, and she did not return to him anymore. But in that moment, they just didn't get to walk out of the ark. There was still waiting that needed to take place. But know this, when God remembers, it is always timely, and it is always right in his timing. You ever taken a long trip with your family? What's the number one question kids like to ask on a trip? Are we there yet? In our family, every time you ask that question, we have to extend the trip by another hour. I'm just kidding. Sometimes it would be great if you could get there faster. Doesn't always happen fast, but with God, it always happens right. When God remembers, it doesn't just demonstrate his faithfulness, it is always timely. But there's something else I think we can see is we see that when God remembers, or in God's remembrance, it leads to deliverance for his people. God delivered Noah in a timely fashion. Ultimately, the waters subside. Ultimately, eventually the ark came to rest on a mountain. Eventually, the land dried out. And then God said those great words in verse number 15, where God said to Noah, "Go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you, and take every living thing, be fruitful and multiply." It's time to go. God remembered Noah and delivered him. And this is where I think we have to be very careful. But to understand, or maybe to wrap our arms and our minds around what it means to be delivered by God, ultimately, if we're not careful, we will focus on temporary deliverance, and we will equate that to God remembering us. And if something that is temporarily not preferred doesn't go our way, we start to wonder if God's forgotten. Anybody ever slipped into that category before? I raised my hand first because I felt that way. But as a follower of the Lord, we realize ultimately that what we need to be delivered from is not this place, not a temporary thing happening here. No, we do need to be delivered from this place, but not into a non-existence. For someday God will deliver his people from here to his presence. God remembers and God delivers. He did it for Noah then. He does it for us today. And in his remembering, in his deliverance, I think one of the biggest ways that he delivers us is that he promises us that while we walk through life's most difficult journey, he will always be by our side. God always remembers. And when he remembers, it demonstrates his faithfulness. It's always timely. It leads to deliverance. But there's something else. When God remembers, in God's remembrance, it gives us hope. God's remembrance gives us hope. See, the world defines hope almost as like something you wish for, but God defines it in a very different way. In the Bible, hope is the confident expectation of what God has promised and his strength to be faithful as he carries it out. We can be hopeful that when God says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. And in the midst of the trial, in the midst of the circumstance, we can go through that circumstance with hope. Hope not in our ability, but hope in God's ability to get us through it. In this situation, Noah's hope was realized when the flood waters subsided, the ground was dried, and he could step out of the ark. And in that moment, his hope was unmatched. And we too can have hope. We too can have hope in a God who is in control of all things. I I think one of the most dangerous places that we can find ourselves is when we find ourselves in a space where we feel like we have no hope. One of the most scary things you can ever hear come out of someone's mouth is where they feel like their situation is hopeless. Hopelessness is a dangerous place for us to find ourselves. Hopelessness keeps us from being able to see that tomorrow eventually is going to come. But can I challenge you with something? My hope is not in tomorrow showing up. No, my hope is in the God who is already in control of tomorrow. And knowing that God remembers us, knowing that God holds true to his covenant, holds true to his promise, knowing that God is a faithful God, gives me hope that I can experience whatever this life might throw my direction. And I still make it through, not because of what I've done, but because of what he has done and because of who he is. So this morning, if you find yourself in a hopeless situation, if you are following after Jesus, I want you to lean into the hope that he has promised to provide for you. That even though you might not know what tomorrow will hold, you can know the one who holds tomorrow. And I pray you'll find hope in him. One final thing I want us to look at this morning is when God remembers, it reflects his grace. When God remembers, it reflects his grace. I think it's interesting when we look at the story of Noah. While Noah found favor in the eyes of God, remember he was seen as righteous, he was seen as blameless in his generation, but was he able to be righteous and blameless on his own? No. He was seen as blameless and righteous because he walked with God because of what God did in him, not because of his own doing. So at the end of the day, when the ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat, when the waters had finally subsided, when the ground had eventually dried up, did all that happen because Noah deserved it? No. It happened not because of his merit, but it happened because of God's grace. And I think this does us a lot of good to realize or to remember that when we find ourselves in a troublesome situation and we're able to make our way through that, or even when we experience life's blessings, we don't do so because we deserve them. We do so in spite of not deserving them. Every good, pleasing, and wonderful thing doesn't come because you deserve it. Every good, pleasing, and wonderful thing comes from God who chooses to give it. It's because of his grace. And that's what grace is. Grace is God's unmerited favor. And if you are a follower of Jesus, if you have placed your faith and hope in him, as we were able to see with Cy this morning, going public with his faith, knowing that baptism did not save him, but it was the grace of God that saved him, not because he deserved it, but in spite of him not deserving it, God saved Cy. And if you're a follower of Jesus, God has saved you not because you earned it, but because he is a gracious God. And I think when it comes to knowing that God will never forget you, God will always remember you, it reflects the grace of God that exists for his people. That no matter what this world might throw at me, I know that I can be safe in the arms of a holy God. This morning, I want you to know this, that if you are following after Jesus, God sees you. He sees your situation. He sees the heartache. He sees the pain. He sees the concern. He sees the anxiety. He sees the not knowing what this life might throw your direction. He sees it all. and he remembers you. He hasn't forgotten you. I think what so many of us need is just to be reminded that God remembers. To be reminded that God never forgets. To be reminded that God is never asleep. To be reminded that God never messes up. God always remembers. And if you are following after Jesus, God remembers you. If you're not following after Jesus, you need to. You need that more than anything. You need that more than your crazy situation being fixed. You need that more than your anxiety to be lifted. You need that more than your depression to subside. You need Jesus more than anything. Because only Jesus will sustain you. So this morning, if you find yourself not following after Jesus, I urge you to cry out to a holy God who loved you so much that he gave his only son to suffer the cross, to be put in the grave, but to conquer the grave, to conquer death, and he is living and reigning today, and his hand is extended to you, saying, follow after me. And today you can know a God who remembers you. Here in just a moment, we're going to have a time of response. And I believe all of us on some level have something that we need to respond with. Perhaps you're here this morning and you need to give your life to Jesus. Just like the story we heard of Sai, you need to say, man, I need to follow after him. And cry out and ask God to forgive you of your sins and to place your faith and hope in Jesus. And start following him today. For some other people here, maybe you've been wayward and you've recently come back, or you need to kind of come back and you want to go public with that. Man, there's nothing like putting a flag in the ground and saying, I haven't been walking with the Lord, but I can look at March 24th of 2024 and say, man, on that day we reestablished that I'm going to follow after Jesus. And perhaps that needs to be you this morning. Or perhaps for someone else, if you find yourself walking through a dark season, you need to grab someone beside you. And you need to tell them, I need you to remind me that God remembers me. Will you pray with me? What a beautiful thing it is for believers to get to do that with one another. Whatever's taking place in your heart, don't miss the opportunity to respond to the Lord. I invite you to bow your heads, close your eyes, and our praise team will come up as we prepare to respond to him. Father God, we confess our need for you. God, we should be desperate for you. Now, we will find ourselves in some of the most darkest and difficult circumstances this world has to offer. But God, those will always fall short of the grace that you have for your people. For God, you will always be faithful. God, your timing will always be right. God, you are the great deliverer. You are the one who brings hope. You, oh God, are the God of